God's chosen ones. 9 signs they can feel your calling even if you say nothing. Have you ever walked into a room and without saying a word, the atmosphere shifted? Conversations paused. Eyes turned. Some stared too long. Orange looked away, too fast. You weren't loud, you weren't even trying. But something in you made people uncomfortable. And maybe you've spent years wondering, why do they react this way? Why do I always feel watched or misunderstood? But what if I told you it wasn't you they were reacting to? It was the light you carry, the light you didn't even know was showing, the calling you couldn't yet name, but they could sense. Because when you're chosen, your presence speaks before you ever say a word. They saw something you didn't even know you carried. Most people walk through life hoping to be seen, but Elleliana Monroe, she stopped hoping a long time ago. Not because she didn't want to be known, but because every time someone looked her way, they didn't see her. They saw something they couldn't explain. She wasn't famous. She didn't command attention. In fact, she tried to shrink in every room she entered. She spoke softly. She kept her head down. And yet, when she walked into a room, people shifted. Eyes flicked over. Some whispered. Some admired. And some grew cold. The stares never made sense. Not when she was 5 and the teacher paused mid-sentence. Not when the girls at youth group laughed at her stillness. But even now, at 37, sipping her coffee and still feeling like she didn't belong in the world she lived in. But deep down, something whispered. It's not rejection, it's recognition. You see, when you're chosen, you don't have to announce it. The room already knows. Because the spirit inside you echoes in the atmosphere long before your lips form words. And today, as Elleliana sips her coffee, a stranger from across the cafe stares too long, then quietly walks over. She leans in. "I'm sorry to bother you," she says, "but I don't know what it is. Something about you feels different, safe, lit." Elleliana smiles politely. She's heard it before, but this time she doesn't feel awkward. She feels seen, because for the first time, she's starting to understand. This isn't about attention. This is about anointing. She never tried to shine, but heaven marked her, and they've been feeling the light ever since. If you've ever been stared at without knowing why, if people react strangely to your silence, if you feel like you disturb the atmosphere just by breathing, this story is for you. Because maybe you're not being rejected. Maybe, just maybe, you've been chosen all along. And part 1, the room always changes when you walk in. Elleliana never tried to be the center of attention. She didn't wear bold colors. She didn't walk loudly. She didn't demand anything. And yet, every time she entered a room, something shifted. Conversations paused. Eyes flicked in her direction, subtle but certain. People readjusted their posture, glanced away too quickly, or stared too long. She used to think it was her imagination. Maybe something on her face, maybe her clothes were wrong. Maybe she was just too quiet. But it kept happening. At work, at church, even in grocery stores and waiting rooms. People would react to her before she ever spoke. One man once whispered, "You carry something. I don't know what it is, but it's weighty, holy. It makes the air feel different." She didn't know what to say, because she had felt it too. That strange tension between being invisible and undeniable. There was a season when she tried to dim it, to shrink into the background, to laugh louder, blend in, act normal. But the atmosphere still bent when she arrived. People grew nervous. Some were drawn to her like she was water in a drought. Others recoiled, like her silence exposed something they'd rather keep hidden. And one day, after a meeting where no one could quite meet her eyes, her boss, a man who never talked about spiritual things, looked at her and said quietly, "You unsettle people in a way I can't explain." She smiled this time, because now she understood. It wasn't her outfit. It wasn't her voice. It wasn't even her personality. It was her presence. Or rather, the presence within her. The reason rooms shifted wasn't because of her shadow. It was because of her light. She didn't enter with ego. She entered with evidence. That heaven had touched her life and left a mark no one could ignore. Because when God sets someone apart, they don't have to speak loudly to be heard. Their very existence becomes a sermon. And now she no longer fears the shift. She honors it, because she knows. Rooms don't change because she walked in. Rooms change because God did.
Part 2. Your eyes carry what heaven saw in you. She never liked mirrors. Not because she thought she was unattractive, but because every time she looked into her own eyes, it felt like they were holding a story she hadn't yet read. There was a depth there, a knowing, a quiet intensity she couldn't quite name. People noticed it before she did. Strangers would pause mid-sentence. Children would stare as if they saw someone they remembered from heaven. Some would smile, others would look away, shaken, unsettled, but no one could deny it. Her eyes spoke. They said things she never dared to say aloud. They carried both the ache of unanswered prayers and the peace of someone who had survived every storm she was never meant to endure. One woman, old, wrinkled, worn from her own years of spiritual war. William once touched Elleliana's hand in a church bathroom and said with tears in her eyes, "You have the look of someone who's seen God and stayed standing." Elleliana didn't know how to respond. She wanted to say, "I'm just tired," but she knew what the woman really meant, because deep down she had seen things. Lonely nights with nothing but her Bible and a locked bedroom door. Mornings after betrayal, when she still showed up smiling. Seasons of silence where all she had was God. And somehow that was still enough. Her face didn't glow like Moses, but there was something in her gaze that unsettled the proud and comforted the broken. Her eyes had watched promises die and still looked for resurrection. They had seen disappointment's shadow and still held light. They had wept without witnesses, believed without proof, and stared down the devil without blinking. Not because she was brave, but because she was marked. Heaven had written something into her eyes that couldn't be erased by time, trauma, or people who walked away too soon. Now she understood. Some people would avoid her eyes because they couldn't lie while looking into them. Others would return again and again, just to feel seen beyond the surface. She no longer needed to explain it, because she realized God had used her eyes to speak what her mouth was never meant to say.
Part 3. They imitate what they secretly don't understand. It started small. A phrase Elleliana had whispered during prayer, repeated by someone else the next week, as if it had always been theirs. Then came the posture, the way she bowed her head when she worshipped. Suddenly others did the same. People began copying how she spoke, the cadence of her voice, even the verses she quoted in passing. She didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe people were just inspired. But then she noticed it happening everywhere. In church groups, on social media, at work. A quiet obedience was echoing, and it felt strange. Not flattering, not offensive. Just She wanted her fire, but not her furnace. Her peace, but not her pain. Her posture, but not her process. No one saw the nights she wrestled with God in the dark. The days she showed up smiling when she was breaking inside. The prayers she whispered for people who'd never say thank you. They wanted the fruit, but not the fasting, the strength, but not the scars. One evening, a young woman from her small group approached her shyly. "I hope this doesn't sound weird," she said, "but I've started watching how you carry yourself. The way you pray, the way you speak. I want to be like you." Elleliana's eyes softened. She didn't feel proud. She felt responsible, because suddenly she realized people were following her footsteps, even while questioning her presence. And that's when it hit her. Being chosen doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with imitation and isolation. Sometimes you become the blueprint people steal from, while never giving you credit. But even then, God is watching. He sees what was birthed in silence, what was forged in secret, what was walked out when no one clapped or stayed. Elleliana began to pray differently after that, not just for strength, but for stewardship. "Lord," she whispered, "if people are going to follow me, make sure I'm following you. Because influence isn't a badge, it's a burden. And when you carry heaven, your footsteps leave prints, even when you think no one's watching." Part 4. Even your mistakes are magnified. She barely said a word. It was a simple misunderstanding. A misread glance, a silence too long, a phrase taken out of context. But by the next day, the whisper had grown legs. The air felt colder. People she once prayed with were now polite but distant. Elleliana stood by the hallway after service, still holding her Bible, still carrying the same spirit, but suddenly feeling like she didn't belong in the house she helped build. All because of one moment. One moment that people were more eager to spotlight than the 100 moments she had poured herself out in silence. She didn't cry. Not this time. She just stared at the exit sign above the double doors, wondering why one misstep felt like a full-blown scandal, when all she ever wanted was to serve. And then, as if God couldn't stand the weight pressing on her chest, a quiet voice stirred inside her spirit. "They watch you closely, not because you are weak, but because you carry something holy." She remembered Joseph, how they didn't believe his dreams until they saw him in the palace, how they exaggerated his flaws because they couldn't stand his favor. She remembered how Jesus healed multitudes, yet was still accused, still crucified, still betrayed by the very people he came to save. And something broke loose in her, a sacred strength, the holy defiance. Let them talk. Let them magnify the moments she falls, because they didn't witness the weight she carried on the days she stood. They didn't see her worship with broken hands. They didn't hear the midnight prayers for people who would never say her name. And they certainly weren't there the morning she rose again, after wanting to give up the night before. Perfection was never the goal. Presence was. Elleliana wasn't called to impress. She was called to reflect. And sometimes that reflection looked messy. Sometimes it looked human. But it always carried the fingerprints of grace. So, she lifted her chin, not in pride, in purpose, because she realized the spotlight of scrutiny only shines that hard on vessels heaven has poured into. Part 5. You were born to shift atmospheres, not fit into rooms. She almost didn't show up. The retreat had sounded peaceful on paper. Mountains, quiet, God. But Elleliana had been so used to walking alone, she wasn't sure what to do in rooms where people wanted to connect. Still, something in her spirit nudged her. Go. Not to fit in, but to release something. So she went. She sat by the fire pit as conversations swirled around her. Laughter here, awkward small talk there. She listened, smiled gently, but didn't say much. And yet again, People noticed her silence before they noticed others' noise. A woman named Joy sat beside her, fidgeting with her sleeve, eyes nervous, voice barely a whisper. "I almost didn't come," she said, "but something told me you'd be here." Elleliana turned toward her. Their eyes met, not just surface to surface, but soul to soul. And in that moment, without a sermon, without a spotlight, without a single deep word, the atmosphere shifted. Joy's eyes welled up, not because of Elleliana, but because what Elleliana carried awakened something in her. Elleliana didn't need the platform. She was the platform, not because she was loud, but because she was available. Available to host heaven. Available to be the one who carried peace into chaos. Stillness into storm. Light into shadow. She never quite belonged in rooms, because she was never called to blend in with them. She was called to transform them. All her life, she thought not fitting in meant she was broken. But now she knew she wasn't misplaced. She was positioned to disrupt, to dismantle atmospheres rooted in pretense, to birth clarity in places polluted with confusion. She wasn't a decoration. She was a declaration, a living, breathing sign that God still moves through quiet vessels. Not everyone would understand her. Not everyone would celebrate her. But when she walked into a room, the room would always remember she had been there. Because when you're chosen, you don't just attend atmospheres. You shift them. You don't have to explain the light, just carry it. She stood at the edge of the retreat meadow the next morning, wrapped in a sweater, coffee in hand, watching the fog lift. No music, no applause. She had silence, the kind heaven speaks through. For years, Elleliana believed something was wrong with her. Why people stared, why rooms shifted, why she never quite belonged. But now she understood. She wasn't too much. She was marked. The weight she carried wasn't heaviness. It was holiness. And the reactions she triggered in others weren't rejection. They were revelation. They were spiritual resistance to a presence this world couldn't categorize. She no longer needed to shrink, or explain, or apologize, because when God chooses someone, He writes it into their walk, etches it into their gaze, and weaves it through their silence. The world may never understand it, but the world will always feel it. So if you've ever been stared at for no reason, if people imitate you but never invite you, if you've been judged harder, followed quietly, or misunderstood often, it's not because something's wrong with you. It's because something holy rests on you. The room doesn't shift because of your ego. It shifts because of your oil. You don't carry noise. You carry presence. You don't have to explain the anointing. Just walk in it. Because the light you carry doesn't need validation. It needs obedience. If this story felt like your reflection, comment, "They saw the light before I did." If this message whispered to your soul, share it so someone else can stop apologizing for being chosen. And if you believe this mission matters and want to help keep the light flowing, support the journey.